exceptional Randos show is produced live in Submarine Studios' base capsule. It's 71 degrees outside, and it's beautiful. It's not that beautiful on the West Coast, though. They just had some tornadoes, which is crazy. I mean, crazy. We live in Indiana, where tornadoes are regular. The idea that a tornado is happening in like Southern California of all places just blows my mind.
And didn't they just have one in Florida?
I think so. Or it was like a giant water spout that like decided to touch land, which is basically the same thing. I thought there was supposed to be a short break between like the end of winter and tornado season's arrival, but I guess
not really.
When I look at windy.com, the northern hemisphere is actually doing pretty good. The only areas of really extreme weather activity seem to be in the ocean. But when I look at the southern hemisphere, oh man, like all the activity is happening south of Australia and south of South America and south of Africa, and in that belt just I guess north of Antarctica. It just looks crazy. It looks like the stuff that was causing all the crazy weather to happen middle of winter actually in the beginning of winter for us, I guess, 6 months ago. Obviously, it's their winter, but
well, and it's just like that storm this morning. There's going to be hurricane strength winds on the mainland in the United States this week, where it's like we're definitely getting some crazy weather. But like you're saying, like the shift didn't seem to be this quick. Usually it was like a build up to tornado, or hurricane season for that matter. In like April into May was, it's like to get some storms, but not tornadoes yet. So this is really wild to start getting tornado season this early.
And I expected,
but also have it. Sorry, go ahead.
I totally expected rain and storms to happen, but extreme weather is the norm now. And if it's not just going to sprinkle, it's going to be like a low cloud that turns into marble-sized drops of water that you think are hail.
Well, and it's also like the zones are shifting in terms of like the tornado season that would usually be in the Midwest seems to be hitting the coast more, while the Midwest gets not the remnants necessarily, but it's like by the time it hits us, it's died down. So the storm fronts are coming from different directions and going in different directions.
Yeah. Well, there is a lot of water that landed on the West Coast this last winter, and I'm sure that's contributing to a lot of the conditions that are happening right now. But you're right. It's interesting. There seems to be some kind of buffer effect. We're supposed to be getting. Well, no, we're supposed to get this kind of weather later in like a month, and then through August. But then it'll end up going through like November. Be okay.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder, like, I wonder if we're gonna have a really hot and dry summer, or if it's gonna be like
oppressively wet.
Yes, oppressively wet, but back and forth between like really hot days and really intense storms that bring like moisture, but also charged atmospheres and like tornadoes and thunder. I don't think this is going to be a mild summer, but I'm wondering if it's going to, like I said, if it's going to be dry or like uh, very storm intense. And I feel like, I don't, it's on record in terms of like, we were talking about mild winter and we basically got a mild winter. Um, so it's like, uh, when you live in a certain place for a long time, you can see the way the weather moves, and it's moving in a very unpredictable pattern, but also a very different pattern, which is where I'm like, to me, that feels more like a heavy storm year if the moisture's present, but that's always the issue, I guess. But it seems like that's not going to be an issue this year. Like if it's raining in California, it's definitely going to be raining in Indiana.
Well, they got record rainfall,
Exactly.
and there's concern that because the ground was so dry that it's not absorbing into the water table. It's just
It's bad when Californians are complaining about rain.
there was I think there was a town that had to evacuate recently because the dam might break. One of those scenarios, they might have mudslides because everything was so dry that this stuff, when the snow melts, when the snow melts, it's just going to rinse everything away. It's so messed up.
That's pretty crazy.
I think those are the challenges of living in that kind of geography. It's great until there's too much snow and it rinses the countryside away.
Well, I think that it's not even the geography so much as the lack of preparation, in that if Indiana didn't get the salt and the plows prepared for every year, this place would be an absolute fucking shithole to live in during the winter. But they prepare for the seasons, whereas like in California, they don't generally have a 4-season plan in every part of the state. So some of them will like
Texas
go to
doesn't have a
shit
4-season plan.
I mean, when you only get 3 seasons generally before climate change,
you don't need it.
You wouldn't need a 4-season plan.
Like, what's a snowplow?
Right? I can only imagine how few snowplows exist in California compared to like Chicago.
They all exist in the mountains.
Alone.
It's in mountainous regions. Only in the high plains and in the Sierras. That'd be the only place they would need. Well, I guess Northern California too, but it would only be in higher elevations, which are extremely expensive to live in because they're not near populated areas, so they don't have resources. I bet the same people who are having to prepare to evacuate because of potential snowmelt. These are the same people that were buried when the blizzards were dumping 10 feet of snow in a day. Like these are the same people who've decided to live in areas that present really serious potential environmental challenges. I guess there's a gambling element to it. For 97% of the time that one lives in this environment, it's going to be amazing. But that 3% of the time, it's going to be an absolute nightmare. Like the stuff that you see in movies that are all cataclysmic survival type stuff. I think 3% is like too much. But I guess that just shows how willing I am to live in like the mountains when I actually think about it. Nice place to visit for that like 97% time, 97% of the year, but that 3% where it's absolutely horrible.
So check this out. Texas Department of Transportation, in the most recent numbers I could find, they have uh, 30 snowplows. So for Texas,
The
it's
entire
a
state?
huge. I think I think so. That's because it's not a city; it's the Texas Department of Transportation. Because this article is about all of North Texas. I mean, this was in 2021, so it may have gone up. Um, which is like, okay, that's not that's not a ton. It's definitely not a lot. But then you go to like Indianapolis, and they have 1,000 snowplows and up to 2,000 drivers as of 2022.
So DFW
Just
owns
that, just the city.
24 of the snowplows. Dallas Fort Worth Airport. They operate 24 snowplows. And then Texas Dot for Northern Texas operates 30 snowplows. That gives me a really good idea of prioritization.
Yeah.
Because I mean, snowplows can obviously, as we know, are used for all sorts of things. But
Well, the issue with airports is they can't have any sort of icing.
yeah, they can't have anything on the runways.
Yeah, so I can. They probably have fucking de-icing jets at like Dallas Fort Worth.
Oh yeah, but
even
I'm
though
sure that their trucks, their utility vehicles, these Oshkosh $900,000 vehicles, yeah, ice. They are also de-icing and snow blowing trucks. They're like super de-wintering vehicles, and they spent 12 million. They had 24 and they bought 12 spent 12 million more dollars on the project to upgrade them. These are incredible machines at the airport. It takes 100 people to use all of them and to maintain them or to operate them. That's pretty cool.
Well, it's wild that people are still afraid of flying in this year, 2023. And the only reason I say that is a friend was talking about how he knows, like, it's one of his friends that's afraid to go on planes as a grown man, where I'm like, yeah, you don't have, grown person, whether it's a man or woman. It's like, I can understand being a child and being afraid to get on a plane, but the regulations, and not even just the regulations, the physics of flying, it's like you're way more likely to get into a fatal accident in a car than a plane.
Well, there are
In terms
fewer
of
airplanes in the air at any given point than there are vehicles.
that alone, but in that context, when you're in the air with other vehicles or with other planes, it would be the equivalent of being on the road with only F1 drivers or only race car qualified drivers.
Yeah.
In terms of like the level of rigor they have to go through to be able to become a pilot
Oh yeah.
is like thousands of hours of training, and regular, like driver's ed is like 5 business days, maybe not even 5 business
I
days.
don't think you actually have to go through a
you don't even
driver's
have
ed
to
program.
go all of them either. Yeah, you don't have to go through that. So it's like, to get a license, you can take this optional class or not even take it. And I've seen, when I took my driver's test to like renew it, somebody who drove there failed the test for her second time, and her friends were consoling her in terms of like, she didn't have her license yet for the first time, but she owned a vehicle and then was just driving, again, the way that when you're on the road, you're operating around people who don't have to follow rules, who don't have to get uh, go through a rigorous set of skill examinations to see if they're capable of operating. Because even when you take your driving test, like I didn't have to take one to renew my license, but when I took it to get my license the first time, it was like at the whim of the person who was like grading me in terms of if they were having a bad day, I might not have gotten my license. But even if I passed all of the things that they set, and that's not like it probably doesn't happen frequently, but the way that it then the other end is like people who probably shouldn't have gotten their license are given a pass because that that administrator sitting there with the human being is like, this kid, they just need this car to go out on dates or whatever. I'm gonna go ahead and give them the license. And they like in the other end of humanizing the person who shouldn't get the license, that's who there's enough of the people who shouldn't get it on the road compared contrasted with in the sky, none of those people are flying in terms of like even to get like your pilot's license just to fly a small plane, you still have to do like hundreds of
Oh
hours,
yeah,
not necessarily thousands, but
thousands of
those people
dollars
aren't
though.
novices. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's thousands of dollars and it's a
tens of
lot of
thousands of
time.
dollars. And you got to
Yeah.
know somebody who has a
So
plane. If you want to do it for
mhm.
less than $10,000 and only pay for fuel, you have to know somebody with a plane who's willing to let you fly their plane, and then you're probably going to end up, performing the required maintenance on said plane because you have to maintain airplanes. It's interesting. You don't have to have a license to buy a car in Indiana. You can just go buy a car as long as somebody has a license to drive it away. That's good to go. I'm pretty sure that when somebody buys an airplane, it's like it's a known event. Like the FAA is like, oh, this plane transaction just occurred. Oh, and you probably have like a certain amount of time to register it because it's got to be stored somewhere. And I bet it's impossible to store a plane at like a facility, like a private, like a rental garage hangar or whatever, like without having a registered plane. I bet it's really difficult for a private individual to own a plane. I mean, forget about the licensing. Actually, no.
Just the maintenance.
Yeah, just the maintenance. Like you gotta have a
Even okay,
hangar.
so check it
You
out.
have to have a hangar and an air and a landing strip.
I've seen a quarter size plane like that's an RC.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um, they're
A
pretty
big
big,
RC plane.
but though the maintenance on those alone is like
Is it like a
it can
car?
yeah, and the cost is not necessarily cheap, but you have to like things break and you have to keep it up to speed in terms of all of the individual little parts. And if you don't know how to do that, then you have to pay somebody else to do that, which can get, really expensive really quickly. So on like a radio control plane, it's not cheap, which is why that hobby is not something you see a lot of people getting into, let alone when it's an actual plane to hold human beings in it. Um, like
Man, a
I
friend of
think a lot of
mine,
people.
friend of
Sorry, go
mine
ahead.
back in high school, his dad had an RC plane. There's actually an RC airplane park just north of town on Old 37, and it's got a shelter house kind of thing, and then just a big field where people would used to fly their remote controlled aircraft. And I remember I don't think it was that big. I think his wingspan was like maybe actually pretty big. It was like a 5 foot wingspan, maybe 6 foot wingspan. Maybe I'm wrong too. It might have been like 4 foot, but it was a decent sized remote control plane. I remember thinking like this is the coolest thing I'd ever seen, like up close and personal, because it had all these servos that controlled the control surfaces. There was so much to it. It was more complex than any model or remote control car that I'd ever seen.
Yeah, the controllers for those things are a fucking
Oh, they're amazing.
complex construction, and you look at it, it's not just like up, down, left, right.
Oh no,
there's
there's like
all kinds of like
there's like trim
the
controls.
foil, yeah, trim.
It's really
It,
here's the thing that gets me. It's really easy to get a car in America. It's really easy to get a license in America to operate that car. Uh, the simulators that exist for driving cars make it seem like it's easy to drive a car at speed because you just respawn or get a different vehicle and start over. But every flight simulator that I've ever used that attempts to be that makes an honest attempt at simulating operating an airplane, it's so easy to crash. You might not even be able to get off the runway before you crash.
oh yeah, it's really easy to crash.
And so I think that airplane simulation is much more honest about you're absolutely going to die if you mess this up, whereas like driving simulators are more like, oh, you'll just bounce off the wall and you'll be fine. And I think that
It's like
there's like a there's a 100% a culture of people who are graduating from PlayStation or Xbox controller to the real thing, having spent hundreds of hours flying, like sideswiping things and running into walls and barriers, and occasionally getting really good at it. But that's actually kind of terrifying because I'm pretty sure the people who graduate from flight simulators to the real thing are like the soberest operators that exist. Like there's no fucking around. There might be a bunch of coffee involved, but the idea is like, yeah, I'm gonna get behind behind the yoke of a multi-million. Actually, how much does an Airbus cost? A321 costs $115 million. An Airbus A330 is a $230 million aircraft. Yeah, nobody is getting behind the yoke of a $350 million Airbus A380 and fucking around. A Boeing 747-8i costs $418 million. I don't think that the pilots of these vehicles fuck around at all.
Well, even then, it's like if you got your private pilot's license, that doesn't mean you can just hop in a 747 because there's so much more complex than like a regular
they might
plane.
only be licensed to fly like like a Learjet or a Jetstar or a personal luxury jet.
Yeah, and I think it's not necessarily to make it more like specifically just to make it more difficult, but it's a matter of like having one propeller versus four engines versus like are you using the engines to taxi or the fucking you know if there's like engines to power the wheels or there's like all different a bunch of different things in terms of how a plane's going to take off compared like in the difference between a smaller aircraft, even like a charter plane is going to be different than the Airbuses. and like even on the
Private pilot's
simulator.
license. You have to have a specific instrument rating on your pilot certificate. You have to have multi-engine rating on your pilot certificate. There's a specific type of rating for that applies to the specific jet, which means you have to be, certified for a specific type of aircraft, and that varies by
Well, and
by
there's
aircraft company. Oh wow.
it's just such a different level of spatial
High
awareness in terms
performance
of like
endorsement, high altitude endorsement. Um, you have to be. What was the other? There's another one. Oh yeah, you have to be certified with a first class medical certificate. 1,500 hours of flight time.
and I
1,500
cannot
hours.
like try to fathom being in control of something that's 247 feet long and trying to like land the back of it first from the front. I mean, I know that description is like kind of obtuse, but the activity itself is obtuse. And that's where I mean, like an individual human being that's like 5 to 6 feet tall, having to control something that's 247 feet long,
From the nose.
208 feet wide, 58 feet tall, and maneuver that thing going like 300 miles an hour to get it from 300 miles an hour to like 30 miles an hour or however fast they're going once they hit the ground and slow down.
I think they decelerate from something like 180 miles an hour down to 60 miles an hour, like
Like instantly.
like faster than any car could ever slow down.
Yeah.
You seen the videos where like the front wheel brakes and it's just like grinding on the suspension on like the knuckle itself, the wheels fail. I remember seeing this video years ago, and it just blew my mind at how tough that that suspension mechanism really is. That it just was like holding itself on like a little post, and then how strong the entire airframe actually is, because it didn't break in half and collapse and kill everybody. I think everyone walked away from that incident. Like aircrafts, when they crash, they often like land on their belly and then slide across an entire like farm, like a giant, big agriculture farm. Almost all of like the flight paths are over farmland. They avoid.
The issue isn't necessarily the impact so much as if there's fuel
Yeah,
and a spark
yeah.
causes it to ignite. And I
But yeah,
think
so they got to
that's
get out really quick.
yeah.
But still, there aren't that many examples of airplanes that crash that explode. There are more examples of airplanes that like crash and people run away, and people are shaken and injured and fucked up. But fortunately, very few of them actually explode. Compared to, like, I guess cars haven't really been exploding until like the last few years. But that's a different kind of explosion. Like battery explosion is different than airplane fuel. Like that's one of those things that's I think is going to become really interesting is the push for electrification actually starts picking up some picks up the pace, it picks up some steam. Um, like China's recent batteries, their crop of batteries, they're all catching on fire, and GM's announcing a new battery type, and Volkswagen has their own battery type, and it'll be interesting to see which processes survive, which ones actually have real lasting power, because liquid fuels have been around for a while, and they pack a lot of potential energy. I just don't see things like big trucks actually transitioning to electricity. I don't think an airplane. I mean, I read recently about a battery powered aircraft, and it flew like half an hour, and everyone was really ecstatic about that. I guess that's kind of cool, but
How big was it? I mean,
I think it held a person.
like a single, yeah, because it seems like
It's definitely not like
um,
capable of being used for like by a bush pilot in Alaska. They might be able to take off and land in the same body of water, but I just don't. I just it's just really it's really strange to me at this point. The more that I read about it, like power generation itself is the biggest problem. Like Toyota's not. They back down from their electric vehicle thing. They're going to focus on hybrids. Everyone's built all the big manufacturers are building electric vehicles. They're all committing to an electric future. And the only thing that I've read recently about breakthroughs in power generation are this like a reactor that Bill Gates helped to finance that uses a sodium reaction to store the energy instead of using water to well use a sodium liquid molten sodium to maintain stable temperature of the fissile material and then also to store the energy because it's much more stable at higher temperatures and so they can regulate the output of energy based upon how much they expose to water when they generate steam. And then he goes on about how the big benefit is that even if there's no um, advanced cooling solution, because of the way that molten sodium expands, it and the way that it translates transfers heat within itself, it'll never get hot enough to allow the fissile material to melt down. It's like basically like stabilizing an engine with oil. As long as there's oil, then it'll be fine, kind of deal. Except it's molten sodium, so it's already really really hot. This is the latest breakthrough that I've read about in a long time. Everything else has been smaller Westinghouse reactors, and nobody's really trying to embrace thorium reactors except the Chinese. And we haven't heard anything about their massive deployment of thorium reactors in a while. That's probably a good thing. I bet if we heard about it, because if there was anything about it in the news, because something went wrong.
right. That seems to be the case. Like, I don't feel like
So maybe it's a good thing
we're
that we
gonna
don't know
get.
anything about the Chinese thorium reactors right
Yeah,
now.
our media is definitely not gonna tell us if they're making advancements. That's for damn
That's a really
sure.
good point. That's a really good. I apologize, internet. I should have known better.
But even it's like, what happened with all the balloons? That shit was the hot discussion for like 2 weeks, and suddenly no more Chinese spy balloons.
They probably came up with a new composition for the balloon's outer structure that repels whatever kind of radar pulses that our systems use. They painted it orange instead of red, and now it's invisible again. I'm really making this up. I really hope that like that doesn't come back to haunt me. That statement. Like I really.
Now they're trying to say that it gathered information from military bases, and it actually was successful. Because man, this is wild. I don't know if people just didn't buy it and it didn't catch on, but they were um, a month ago. It looks like trying to get this story back out. And then there was another balloon 6 days ago, but they didn't say where that one was from. but they said it wasn't China's. Or that they did say that,
Oh,
but
there are currently 5 known Chinese balloon flights into U.S. territory, including two. Oh, this is the total. Two during Biden's administration thus far, and three during the Trump administration. Huh. That's how many they will officially
that
recognize.
we know about.
Yeah, it's the ones
Yeah.
that they have recognized as Chinese spy balloons. There have been 5 officially. So if there were 5, that means there were probably like 20 to 100 that they didn't catch.
Yeah, they got to be like roaches.
There's like a balloon net of a cloud of balloons that are all connected to each other with some weird Chinese IOTA devices.
Yeah, because I imagine they find the big ones, but there's probably smaller ones that they don't.
Yeah. There's like the main body balloons and then like satellite balloons that orbit the main body
Mm,
balloons. And there are like groups of those, multiple groups of those that are all in a giant web net of cloud balloons. That's why you only get random calls that are with people speaking Chinese when you're in a city because they can focus their efforts there. I'm pretty I want to think that it's like they're really just floating around with cell phones and calling people with whatever like state Chinese scam that's going on where they call and say like, hey, we're repatriating people, we'll give you your money back, come back to China.
yeah, it's always so difficult to know like what's real and what's propaganda in terms of things like that. Because they'll make it seem like there's all these benefits for Chinese citizens, but then you find out it's like only for rich citizens or some shit, and it's like, oh well,
Yeah, it's
it's,
only if
it's
you go
it's
back
it's
with like
partial truth.
you have to have millions of dollars, millions of dollars to
Yeah,
repatriate back to China. They don't want people to come back with like, you know, just the stuff they can carry. You gotta bring back a business that you started in
Mhm.
America. You have to own property in America. I think also, you know, while I do like to remind people that China is capable of producing items of quality, that there's still an incredible, like, just I can barely believe it myself, market of clones, knockoffs, fakes, whatever. And it just blows my mind. Like, I was looking at AliExpress the other day. I was looking at fancy guitars and basses, and they've got fancy guitars that are like 1/5 the price of what they would sell for in America in terms of like what they look like. Now, I can't attest to the quality of their electronics or the actual build quality, but just from the images, assuming what is in the images, what was delivered, and it's nice looking, these things are incredible. I don't know how people can compete with that kind of output or product at that price point. It doesn't make sense to me how any manufacturer can compete with that. But
Well, I imagine the consistency is not there in
I
terms
mean,
of like.
some of them are made
I
in the
bet
same OEM factories, like Guitar Town, China, Guitar City, China.
I'm
As
sure, but I'm saying if you ordered the one that's like the non-brand, they're the ones that don't have the same quality
oh yeah,
control.
no,
So
no,
it's like
I mean,
every third.
that's kind of the part of it is that the hardware itself is junk. Like nine times out of 10, the hardware is absolutely not up to standard. And and then there are electronics that get pawned off. Like, there's a microphone that I like. It's manufactured by Shure. It's the SM7B. It's a $400 microphone. It's one of those cream of the crop dynamic microphones. It has the sound, and AliExpress, they have these things, listed at $100, and the sellers are going to great lengths to make it seem like, oh yeah, they're using the original Unidyne 2 capsule, and the circuit topography matches, and all the components are matched, and all this stuff. And I look at these things, and it's like, wow, they really went to great lengths to emulate the Shure marketing. The things that don't match are like, the grill screen, the metal grill screen itself inside the foam, the foam pop capsule. Like they're little tiny things that I recognize because I've seen what the real thing looks like. I've owned one. I've sold them, and so I can see this. I'm sure that most people who are very interested in the real thing also can see this. But at $100, somebody's going to buy that, and then they're going to market their service as having these kinds of microphones, and that's going to attract a certain type of recording enthusiast or artist, and on this idea that they're using a certain microphone when they're not. And of course, it's in China where Shure can't do anything. Shure can't call the Chinese Trade Bureau and say, "Hey, these guys are committing copyright infringement and selling bogus products." China's like, "Yeah, so what do you want us to do?" go for it.
Right.
Like my dad and I talked about this, and he said, like, who are they actually going to go after? How are they going to find them? How are they going to know when they've found the right person? How would they even like get their money back in Chinese court? Would Chinese court even recognize this kind of claim? I think at one point when that whole like Trans-Pacific Partnership thing was about to go into effect, there would have been a mechanism to do that, but then it didn't happen. And then NAFTA 2.7 happened or whatever. NAFTA 3 happened. CAM, AMP, whatever they called it. And then there were no protections to intellectual property across the Pacific. There actually would have. What's interesting is that I'm pretty sure that all of the other nations that were going to enter into Trans-Pacific or the trade partnership thing, the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact, whatever it was, they ended up signing it minus the United States. That's just like a big kick while we're down. It's like, yeah, we could have been a part of this thing that would have protected U.S. intellectual property. We could have done that. Nope. We had to force companies that have manufacturing processes in Asia to negotiate terms on their own without the broad negotiating power of essentially what amounts to like a union of manufacturers to come together to have increased bargaining power. Instead of doing that, nope, America gets, they're left outside of that room, which is crazy. And now there are more and more knockoffs of things.
Yeah, so we kind of deserve what we get.
Yeah.
For not playing nice earlier. Well, and it's like, I don't know when the last time you've been to like Washington, D.C., which I haven't been there. It's been probably maybe a decade since I've been there. But what would happen is there'd be these people who would sell knockoffs to tourists, and you could go to any monument and there'd be people selling knockoffs in front, and that went away in terms of like it's not that prevalent anymore. But there would also be these places in New York where it was just like buildings full of knockoffs, and it wouldn't have like a label on the front, and it wouldn't be like it wouldn't look like a store. It would just look like a building that, you wouldn't be able to tell if it was residential or not. But you go inside and it's like level one is knockoff Tommy Hilfiger, level two knockoff Fubu, level three is knockoff Boss, and it's like
That's like the Silk Road Mall in Beijing.
but it's these places exist in America too, and it's like it doesn't necessarily even matter if it's connected to the Chinese markets or not so much as um, I think there's always a market for knockoffs for people who don't care about quality control. And I think that's where ultimately getting to it, it's like, if you just want to buy it for the brand and you don't actually care if it's like really good quality or not, just because you just want to like take a picture with it or some shit. So it doesn't have to be the best quality and it doesn't have to be real. Or you just want to like make it seem like you have the real thing. And I think the market underestimates that in like regular people in terms of like, yeah, you can make laws against it, but people are gonna buy their bootleg shit as long as they can. They're gonna buy bootleg shit, and there's there's just a certain segment of people that are gonna do that.
Like Sony, Soony, or that's Sunny, Sonny, Sony.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's like the gag in You Don't Mess with the Zohan, where the electronic shop is called Going Out of Business, and next to it is a shop called Grand Opening. They sell knockoff electronics products. That's a thing, though. The gray market is it was a big thing. I don't know how big it is still, because it's almost like direct purchase now. You can just go to AliExpress and there's the gray market. And that stuff's dangerous, because if you get like a gray market, even if you get a real product like a gray market like camera, let's say you got a camera from Southeast Asia, you can't get that serviced in America. It
Right.
breaks, you got to send that to Singapore.
But then that's where I guess usually gray market stuff, it's like usually at a cost point where you don't actually care about getting it serviced because you can just buy another one. And I think that's the appeal in a lot of cases.
I think that's how it used to be. But when I see the prices of like a gray market like a Canon camera versus what it costs in the United States, there is a discount, but it's and you're right, it's like it's almost like a really hardcore rental fee, in the sense that you get to use it until it breaks, which may be a long time. It might be years, but there's no getting it serviced at the end of it. But it's at a low enough price point that it's actually reasonable, as long as nobody handles it poorly and it doesn't break. That's I think that's part of the cost, the total cost of ownership analysis. But I think that for any industry that requires tools that are used regularly and in environments that could lend to rough handling, that's a big risk. But I don't think any professional videographers are actually buying gray market cameras. They might buy a gray market lens for fun, because that would actually be reasonably affordable.
Well, and I think part of it is like, if you as an individual have the capacity to not necessarily reverse engineer something, but be able to service it yourself, that also makes a huge difference in terms of buying gray market things. Like if you bought a gray market guitar, but you're able to like restring it yourself, then it doesn't matter if it comes with shitty strings.
Oh, I can change, and that's the thing with a lot of that stuff. I can change out all of the hardware for superior hardware, and because the hardware they come with is an inferior facsimile of good hardware, the mounting locations are still in the right place. So a lot of the time, retrofitting quality hardware on like a gray market guitar is as simple as removing a few hosts and just installing new hardware. A lot of that stuff is so easy. To me, it kind of kills the hobby of assembling a parts caster where select all the parts yourself and throw it together. Here's a guitar now that has a finish that no normal human could ever produce on their own. You'd have to have like a real paint shop and know what you're doing. And by know what you're doing, I mean like applying finishes to guitar bodies by the hundreds every week because they're pumping them out like a factory. And so, I mean, like when I say like, man, that's like the most beautiful guitar I think I've ever seen. That was my reaction to this $400 instrument that has it's basically just buying a body because the tuners and the electronics and the bridge hardware would all be replaced. But still, even then, it comes out less than I would spend selecting individual components and putting it together myself and then finishing it myself. And I can't produce a finish like a factory quality finish. I just don't have those tools. I don't have that paint. And they buy paint by the, not just the gallons, but like by the barrel. They're operating on a scale that I can't even fully comprehend. And so, I mean, I guess it's fun to assemble an instrument, but it's not. It's not as fun as playing it. I would rather play the instrument than worry about all those other things. I guess that actually reveals to me my own like dedication to that, or my own interest in that kind of hobby. I really just want to play the guitar. I don't really want to build them.
I think that's part of it in terms of like, yeah, if you wanted to race cars, that's what you would do, but you want to build them in addition to like drive them, not even necessarily drive them fast. And I think
Yeah,
that's where it's easy to like not have to do all of the parts necessary, or if you want to do all the parts you can, but that doesn't mean you necessarily enjoy all the parts.
yeah.
Um, and then it's about saving costs or some shit. So I think that's where everybody doesn't get a chance to have hobbies, but I think that's part in terms of having an output or something that is actually like generated from a hobby makes it easier to um, focus on that part in terms of like it it doesn't have to be monetizable either, and that I don't think that even makes it like validated. But I think if you don't see some sort of progress or something that is tangible, even in the form of like a credit,
Well, I think it's really difficult for
difficult.
people to measure development of discipline,
Right.
and
Yeah.
so it's actually I think it's impossible for a lot of people to measure progress with something that's very abstract, something that you don't get to perceive yourself because the entire process of doing it involves physical and psychological changes that are imperceptible in the moment, and then it's only upon like reflection over the course of time, and you have to look back like not just like a couple of weeks or months, but like a year or years, multiple years, and then all of a sudden all of that progress reveals itself. It's like, holy crap, look how far I've come. But I don't think those light bulb moments or those bell moments happen frequently. And I don't think that everyone is essentially attuned to even recognize when those moments happen. Like the aha moment, I think that those that actually slips by unnoticed most of the time. Or maybe it doesn't
Well,
happen
and I
as
think
often
they
as I think
can't
it
be
does.
frequent.
It
I
can't
don't
be.
think they can be frequent.
They can't be.
And the ones that make it appear as if it's frequent are usually like the appearance of aha moments, but not real. And I think that's
Oh
kind of like,
man, I wonder how many times Quincy Jones had moments. Like, oh, that wasn't good.
probably more than not, you
Oh
know?
man, I bet he had his more than his share of like moments, because he had a lot of really good aha moments too. I wonder
Okay.
I wonder how that actually works, because like there's got to be some kind of like, like an average of, you're going to experience this many groaning moments before you have the aha moment. Like it averages out across, like, everything. And I'm sure that that's actually a thing. It would have to be, because nobody bats 1,000. Nobody knocks it out the first time. And if when they do, the perception that they did is usually the result of an impressive team of people who have done it before, and already are experienced and have a lot of talent to contribute to a project.
Well, and it's like, okay, if you look at Quincy Jones's discography, the last time he produced a hit was like really in the 90s.
Yeah.
Like realistically in the 90s. But he's still one of the best producers ever, um, especially as someone who's still, it's like, I don't,
Jazz abroad.
I think
How I
he's
feel about
technically still
jazz.
active. I think he's technically still active, but I don't know, who wants to hear something from like a 90-year-old producer?
Well, I think the stuff he's most active with now is, that I'm aware of, is this. I think they're Belgian or French, or maybe they're from the Netherlands. I can't tell. I haven't figured that out. They're called Dirty Loops, and their singer he sounds like Michael, which is really weird. Well, not completely, but he can sing in that range, and he's got his own like vocal quality to it. But he operates in the same range that Michael did, and so and he plays the keys, and so it's a three piece, and they remind me a lot of Jamiroquai, but with more pop sensibilities. And then, of course, it turns out that Quincy Jones is deeply involved with their singer, this guy Jonah Nilsson, um, and they just make really really fun pop music. But it's a pop band, a trio, really good stuff. They But that's the extent of my knowledge of what he's involved with right now or recently, and I think that was actually a few years ago too. It wasn't him like conducting. He's definitely, you know, but his career's been going on like 50 years now, it seems.
70.
That 70 years, jeez.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is where I'm like, it's really been like 30 years since he's made a hit,
Yeah,
30 years ish,
everything's
or produced a hit in terms of like, you know, I don't think that necessarily determines the extent of someone's career either, but
it
that's
looks like
also,
he was involved in Amy Winehouse. Oh, It's My Party featuring Amy Winehouse. Involved in a Sanford and Son production, and those were in 2010. So 13 years since he was involved with something, but there's no indication of the depth of his involvement. 99, Something I Cannot Have. 96, Slow Jams with Babyface, To Me, Barry White, and then Stomp. That's in 96. 95, Put a Move on My Heart. Yeah, I'm not really. I don't really recognize much of this list. Some of these names are kind of familiar, though. I mean, Barry White, obviously. Babyface is a familiar name. Evan Campbell is. I don't know why that's familiar. Chaka Khan is from. That's 1989. Ray Charles and Chaka Khan. I'll be good to you. Yeah, it looks like 30 years ago was the last time he was actually really, really relevant. Man, that guy worked with everybody.
Yeah, he really did.
My God, like Frank Sinatra and Count Basie and Donna Summer and Little Richard. Obviously Michael Jackson, but Dizzy Gillespie and Aretha Franklin and Ella Fitzgerald and good Sammy Davis. Everybody. This guy worked with everyone. He worked with like literally every like the giants of jazz for 40 years straight. It looked like Louis Armstrong is on this list. Cannonball Adderley. What the crap?
Which I think that's, then it becomes natural for people to look to someone like him for the next thing because he's able to do it for so long. But then after a while, it's like you can't pick him anymore, but people still look to him. So he has to keep making those choices.
You want him in the room because it's like having a good luck charm.
Right.
It's like having some really esteemed professor sign on to your research. God, he like arranged music with everyone. Miles Davis, like everyone. I'm almost at the top of or at the end of the list that I'm looking at of all of his stuff. Okay, I'm at the end of the list. He's worked with every record label that was important for the last, 60 years, basically. I wonder how much of an influence like his decisions had on like the recording process that followed after him, and then how the technology itself changed as a result of the way that he did things and like the sensibilities that he brought to production. I know that there are a lot of really high level audio engineers and producers that have their own like plug-in signature plugins that are made by software manufacturers that reflect the kind of decisions they make. And so I wonder like if that kind of thing even existed in like the pre-digital and in the early transition into digital recording. I bet
Well, I
he's
know
like
a lot.
Yeah.
In terms of, I know the Beatles also had a lot to do with that transition in terms of like studio artists have had to uh, set up their like production um, relative to the output. So it's like them converting to digital and going through that phase. I'm sure Quincy Jones really, whatever side he was on in terms of being adamant about how to navigate through the industry, I'm sure he had a huge voice in it in terms of like it was almost impossible for those people not to, because it was such a big part of their output
Yeah.
and their product. So I mean, and I feel like it'd be hard to really find his perspective from Googling it and just picking out a couple different quotes. But really like examining what he did during that transition, because like the quotes may be one thing, but then what he was doing business wise may be something completely
I mean,
different.
we could always just ask ChatGPT to make up some quote and attribute it
Yeah.
to Quincy Jones.
Yeah. Man, it's so funny, like how much ChatGPT will tell people what they want to hear, and then people don't see that as a problem in terms of like, I saw there was a study saying that ChatGPT was more empathetic than a doctor in like 76% of the responses or something that they measured. And I'm like, well, of course it's going to tell people what they want to hear, and then that person's going to make that like rate that higher than the doctor who's going to tell them something that they don't want to hear, which is why doctors generally hold their diagnoses anyway, in terms of if there's somebody that needs to lose weight, the doctor's not necessarily going to tell them. They'll just dance around it and like prescribe them some fucking methamphetamine to make them lose weight, instead of telling them like, hey, you're overweight. Unless it's a black woman, and then they'll blame everything on the overweight. And so there's like all these things about doctors not doing what the patient wants, and then that being a bad experience. But of course, ChatGPT is going to be better and more empathetic in terms of like
That's like the stuff
giving you what you want.
It's like that stuff that was on the media like a couple of months ago. Was the diabetes drugs that are being used for weight loss, Trulicity, Victoza, and Ozempic, and there's like a shortage of these because they're supposed to be for diabetes, but they're being overprescribed to people that are like that don't have diabetes, that aren't even pre-diabetic, and they're being consumed like by not overweight people to control their weight.
Well, I know insulin was a problem, and I mean, it probably still is a problem in the bodybuilding community in terms of like, apparently they use it to help them cut weight. But then it's like the side effects from insulin obviously are not worth abusing it for bodybuilders. But like, there's a segment of bodybuilders that are willing to do anything in their minds to win, which includes like using insulin to cut weight. When you're not diabetic. But also apparently one of the side effects is like the same as the HGH gut, in terms of when you see people who are bodybuilders and they have that like bulbous gut that looks like they have a turtle shell on their front. That's because they're either using human growth hormone or insulin or something. Like, that shit is not just the result of lifting too many weights. It's like their gut, they get a lot of intestinal fat. So their gut just becomes bulbous in terms of like, they may not have a lot of body fat, but they're carrying fat in their actual intestines and in their gut.
Oh, when organs start building up fat, it's really bad because it means that they can't function properly. Like I know that like there's an issue with fatty liver tissue with certain diets.
Yeah, it's called visceral fats. Um, but visceral fat is like the one that nobody ever really talks about because it's not really visible. Um, and like body fat is the one that people are generally obsessed about, even though the visceral fat is really the one that's like the sign of your health. Because people can have high body fat and low visceral fat, which doesn't seem like possible, but it happens. And that's where you can have low body fat and high visceral fat. And that's what ends up happening with a lot of the skinny fat people too. It's like looking healthy is a myth in terms of like you can't see visceral fat, like, and body fat isn't everything. If not, body fat really like not being a determinant of health at that. So I think we're coming out of it somewhat. But I think a lot of it has to do with the low body fat is unsustainable. Like you can't do it permanently, especially as you get past like 40 and shit like that. But you're seeing people come out and like talk about it being unsustainable. So like the way Arnold looks now, he doesn't. I'm sure in his mind he would rather look like young Arnold, but he's accepted that old Arnold can't look like young Arnold. So he's in his different mindset now. Whereas when he was young, he didn't have to deal with that and didn't have to like encourage others not to try to look like him when he was young. And now I think he's in a lot more of a conciliatory mindset and like, well, no, okay, let me take that back. I know when he was doing the like president fitness test, it wasn't about looking a certain way, it was about getting healthy. So he's always had this like focus on health rather than looks as his message. But it's more believable now, I think, that he doesn't look like young Arnold. And I think that's where like knowing that he has been young Arnold and now that he looks like this, it's a lot easier for people to accept his message. Whereas before, if there was somebody who didn't look ripped and they were like, yeah, you shouldn't worry about abs, you shouldn't worry about pecs, just worry about, how's your heart rate? How's your breathing? Are you out of breath after you do a flight of stairs? Well, that's a problem. Like, instead of, I think it got to a point where there was such a focus on abs as a reflection of health that it's unsustainable for people who aren't genetically predisposed for having like 6 or 8 pack abs anyway. But now knowing that like it's not really sustainable year round for hardly anybody, even athletes, they don't necessarily look like that year round. But because we're not seeing images of them.
Yeah, there's like a name for that tissue that crosses the abdominal plane that allows people to have. It's like a connective tissue, right? That allows people to have either a 6-pack or an 8-pack. Yeah, like that tissue itself. Like we can't just have more of it. Is it the fascia? I know that's like one of those things that some people just have a 6-pack or an 8-pack or more. Some people only have like 4. Some people have like just 2 big bands of muscle on their abdomen, and it's just because that's the way their abs.
Yeah, it's fascia.
Yeah, that's just the way that their abs are, and not everyone has that kind of shape. and some people might have a 6-pack, but it might be asymmetric. Some people have a 5-pack because they just don't have one of those bands of fascia to hold their muscle into that shape. But it doesn't mean that their abs are somehow not as capable of development.
So there's a specific fascia called Scarpa's fascia that's found in the like lower wall, that if you don't have a well-defined Scarpa's fascia, it's going to be really difficult for you to get that 6-pack look. And people who have really defined Scarpa fascia may end up getting 8-packs, or like it looks like they have 8 or 10-packs because their Scarpa's fascia is more defined. And I think now that we know things like that have more influence on one's capacity to have like sculpted abs than how much weight someone lifts or how many sit-ups they do,
or how well their heart functions at the end of exercise, like cardiovascular
then there's
function is important.
I mean, and what's crazy is like, okay, let me say this. I don't think women who are attracted to men are put off by abs, but it never seemed to be the like thing that they cared about so much as what media made it seem like they cared about in stories that were usually written by men who also didn't necessarily have 6-pack abs. So it was like this fantastical version of what they thought women wanted based on them not having abs, to know that the attention that the dudes with abs get is more for men than those types of women, because those types of women, while they exist, they're not the majority of the women population. So that's where it's like, I want to say like the Joss Whedons specifically that wrote these stories that made it seem like dudes need abs to be able to like be viable as like a romantic interest, when in reality that's just a dude's fantasy of a hyper masculine version of himself that doesn't really exist either. So it's like this weird, layers and layers.
There's that dissection of rapper beef, that it's like 2 guys sitting alone in a room writing poetry at each other. That's what you just reminded me of.
Well, it's funny in terms of like, it was like a couple of weeks ago. We were watching Murder, She Wrote, and there was like a guy who was hitting on Jessica, and he was bald as shit. And I'm like, man, like the idea of using a bald guy as a romantic interest is like, I don't know if that's something that would be possible today because of the perceptions of what is acceptable for beauty aesthetics. And it got me thinking in terms of like, why people in modern times don't think that would be a vibe. Like if somebody's like balding, like not necessarily young people, but modern media would portray it as if somebody who's balding is not a viable mate, or not viable in any regard, in a way that wasn't happening in the 80s and 90s, down to like Patrick Stewart is probably one of the last bald actors that made it through before you had to really have hair to get cast. And I mean, in terms of like, trying to think of also non-black, because this is where black dudes can pull off bald heads really easily because it doesn't look like a light bulb. Whereas
The
fucking
Rock,
Moby.
The Rock can be have a bald head,
Yeah, The Rock can be bald. He
but
doesn't really count.
but
He doesn't
John
count.
Travolta,
Like,
dude,
okay, Bruce Willis also. I think he might.
he's
It's
been
weird though, 'cause
bald long enough that I think it's just kind of part of the shtick. But John Travolta, bald is really weird looking.
yeah, it's really weird. And I think when he went bald, they tried to make him into a badass, and it didn't work because everybody's seen him doing his little hip gyration thing, and it's like you can't turn that dude into like a fucking villain in a Punisher movie.
Well,
I'm sorry, like
the bulb to
Saturday Night
jaw,
Fever.
the bulb to jaw ratio isn't right, whereas Bruce Willis's bulb to jaw ratio is good.
It's not even about that so much as like, nah, bro, Saturday Night Fever is not about to be a villain in any movie. Because every time he's trying to intimidate somebody, they'll be like, "What are you gonna do, Saturday Night Fever?" And then he has to walk away with his head down.
What was that movie where he was like a super villain, Swordfish?
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was a really tough sell.
It was a tough sell. It really was, and
That was so tough. It was easier to believe that Hugh Jackman was a master hacker. It was so much easier to believe that Hugh Jackman was a hacker than John Travolta was a villain.
Yeah. Swordfish was a good movie too, which again, it's like nothing against his actual performance, but I'm not buying him as a badass. I'm just not. Same way with what's that dude? The pianist,
Adrian Brody? Is that
Adrian Brody? I'm not buying him as a badass. Fucking Predator. No.
Predators was good. It
was a good movie, but I just cannot help like every time the pianist is gonna take down a predator. I don't think so. And that's where again it's like once a person does a certain role, it's like, okay, Christian Bale being the machinist, that took so much dedication that it's not like you don't imagine this dude as like this frail, scrawny thing forever, because him being that small almost pulls you out of believing it. And it's like, oh, he's really committed to this role in like getting to be that small. So it's almost like
Matt Damon shaved his head for Elysium, and that was a good decision. And
yeah, okay, he's a great example of somebody who can go the full range of like, from Good Will Hunting, this fucking
super math nerd to like badass cyborg man
to crazy guy who's gonna kill you to save himself when you thought he was gonna be a good guy, like Matt Damon, and then to the guy mocking himself on stage, like completely just mocking himself and then pulling it off and being funny. Not everybody can do that. And like, I feel, okay, Dave Bautista, I think he's bald now. He may be somebody else that's able to pull it off. But he also doesn't count in terms of like, he's not really white. And that's where I think,
like
again,
Filipino
it's like,
or Indonesian, right?
Yeah, it's like really hard for white dudes in modern times to, I guess Jason Statham. Okay, Jason Statham, bald as shit. But that's where there's only a few.
Yeah, Greek and Filipino.
You really have to be believably badass in order to be able to pull off that bald head look in media. But I don't think actual women care that much in terms of like, I had this thought, and then on another podcast I watched, one of the hosts was talking about how she's attracted to bald men, and I'm like, holy shit, that's exactly what I thought. That's exactly what I thought. And I'm like, okay, in terms of like, it seemed like she's breaking ground by saying it, because you don't hear women talking about it in terms of like, I feel like a lot of times the women's voices that we're portrayed with in media are written by men, and it's not necessarily women's thoughts that we're getting. So then when you like hear a woman's thoughts unfettered by a male writer, it's like it sounds groundbreaking, but it's been there the whole time. If you talk to women, in terms of like, yeah, women don't really care about abs. If they're attracted, like I said, if they're attracted to men, they don't generally care about it. But if you watch media that's written by men, you think that's all they care about. So I think there's this like we're getting past that contrived veneer of male writers' rooms.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just asked Google famous bald actors, and people also ask, who is the bald guy in Fast and Furious?
That's funny. Which again,
which
like,
one? Thanks, Google.
Yeah, I guess Vin Diesel, but he's also mixed race. So
but also The Rock is
count.
Rock is also in the series, and so is Jason Statham, or in the universe. And we got a bunch of.
Well, it's funny with Vin Diesel. He's one of those people who'd been low key passing and not really letting on to him being mixed race for like years and getting these doing Riddick and Pitch Black and shit. And they were definitely like getting him in his lighter time of year when he hadn't had a tan or whatever. So I think a bunch of white people thought he was white, which is where, Diesel doesn't really tell you where he's from. Like, what is that? Is that Italian? Diesel?
I mean, obviously he's from Detroit.
Well,
with a name like Diesel.
Have you seen those videos of him breakdancing as a teenager?
Yeah.
Where it's like he's definitely mixed race in terms of like
culturally.
The fact that those videos exist of him in the 80s.
Oh, he's from Alameda County, California. Oh, but they later moved to New York.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense then.
Okay.
But it's like the video is funny in terms of he's not the best dancer, he's not the worst dancer, but you can tell that it's like there's something authentic. Going on. Yeah, it's authentic. It's like his genetics are carrying his dance where he didn't practice. You could tell he didn't practice enough, so the shit wasn't quite as smooth. But it was like his DNA got him through the steps.
He's also got a really good build. I mean, he's got a lot of mass up in the shoulders, and that's.
Well, it's like okay, and I'm not there. There's certain things where you're like, it sounds racist, and it may end up actually being racist. But it's like I couldn't dance off beat if I tried. I fucking can't do it. In terms of like, it's like I really have to try to dance off beat. But everybody can't, like my dad can't sing on beat if he tried.
not so everyone can establish a polyrhythm in their mind that has discontinuity with a profoundly present beat in any environment. If there's a real beat in a room, most people will sync up to it if they can. Mm-hmm. But not everyone who can sync up to that can develop their own polyrhythmic sense of time that can break free of an established time. It's hard for a lot of people. Like almost impossible for most people.
And that's where I know I get that from my mom because she like conducts choirs and shit like that. So it's like knowing that specific trait between my two parents is like so wide in expression, but knowing that like mine is a certain way. It's like, yeah, there are certain things that you definitely like. It's like definitely genetic inheritance in terms of things like capacity to stay on beat. And, it's not a little thing in terms of drums being very tied into human civilization as like or rhythm as being something, even when it comes to cadence of speech. Like rhythm is not new or something that is newly introduced to our species, but some people are better at it than others for sure, which is where there's this notion of like white people not being good at rhythm, whereas it's like
That's just not true.
Obviously it's not true. It's more so like the way that it's expressed, it comes off relative to a certain type of orientation in terms of like white people, from what I observe, tend to orientate towards the 1 and the 3, whereas black people tend to orientate towards the 2 and the 4.
Well, that's where the magic happens.
And that's like
fundamental to
not
jazz.
it's not like a hard and fast rule, but if somebody's ear is on the 1 and the 3, it's gonna sound offbeat to the 2 and the 4 ear. And I think it's like that that cultural difference is why you end up getting white people who can do the 2 and the 4 that end up playing jazz or playing rock
anything
and
they
roll
want.
Or some shit like.
You can land on the 2 and the 4. You can play anything you want.
But it ends up sounding more like black inspired music because it's on a different downbeat and a different upbeat than what most white music in like Western culture is doing. And I think that's where like, even in terms of Western, not definitely not all Western music, but a lot of mainstream Western music is just a general 4/4 that doesn't get too much variation out of that to get into the mainstream. And I think that's where like the West,
I think the only the biggest deviation from the 4 on the floor snowplow is Caribbean music, where there might be a plow.
I wouldn't even consider that West though, right?
It's kind of, it's like it's in the Western Hemisphere.
I mean, if it was part of the West, like we wouldn't call it Caribbean.
I know, but like there's a lot of
almost by definition, it's not. They're not including it as part of their culture.
Yeah, but at this point, a lot of of Caribbean music has bled into like South Coast, and so
right, they've appropriated it for sure.
But I think
that doesn't mean it's Western.
I know, but like it's still it still has a very distinct kind of plow to it, but it's much more like rhythmically diverse. And the only reason I'm really only lumping it is because it's directly south of Florida where it's happening, like literally just fly south, and this variation of music happens, and it's not just like old timey folk music. It's like the Caribbean is the home of dub music, which is one of the fundamental electronic musics, like foundation level electronic music comes out of the Caribbean. It's not just reggaeton and dance hall, right? It's just like really
here's
important.
How I can prove it's not the West, because when Caribbean people go to London and make music, suddenly it's European, and then it's Western, because that's how you get the fucking drum and bass. It's like, no, those were Caribbean people, but suddenly it's a European creation because they happen to be on a different island. And that's where I'm like,
okay, that's a strange technicality, but I'll accept.
I mean, it's not even a technical. That's them separating it out in terms of like King Tubby producing dub music on the island in the Caribbean is not considered part of like even black African American music. I mean, he's obviously not African American, but it's like not the same musical lexicon in terms of like if you're discussing black music in the 60s and 70s, if you're talking about America, you're not going to bring up King Tubby.
I think that's like
And
that's so sad because
I mean, it's not. I mean, I think in terms of like, I don't think it's sad because black people in America may not necessarily have anything in
I mean
common with black
I
people in the Caribbean,
remember
and that's where
I
the
remember when
music
I
sounds
first
completely
learned about
different.
King Tubby and like building his own reverb units and developing big high pass filters to put on like every channel, and doing things that would become fundamental to electronic music production decades later, and because you know
Well, okay, that's a perfect example in terms of like somebody
and
like
he built
King
his own
Tubby,
mixer. That's the coolest stuff.
then Jimi Hendrix making music out of Britain. I
Yeah,
mean, America too, obviously.
mostly
But
Britain though.
what does their music have in common? Like it's very processed. Both of them have heavy effects, but they don't sound anything alike. So to put King Tubby and Jimi Hendrix in the same discussion because they both happen to be black and both happen to use effects on their music, it would be so overly reductive. And then in the process, the similarities would be contrived that's where I'm like, it makes sense in a certain realm as like why they're being separated out. But I don't think they should necessarily be retrofit together because it's like not the
Oh no,
same.
I
And
don't
that's
think.
what I
I
mean.
think
Like,
that the discussion of Hendrix usually revolves around his performance of the instrument and the way he used effects, like on the stage and in the studio. Whereas King Tubby, every discussion that I've ever had about his production, it's like production sensibilities uh, that served the composition that helped to make the whole performance of dub music what we recognize today. And a lot of that stuff, like I think the only way that they can really be talked about in the same way is in terms of rule breaking, in terms of saying like, oh, that's what that's for. Well, I'm going to use it like this, and you're going to record it. But similarly, that's where it ends because King Tubby used delays or created foldback systems that, I mean, wouldn't be utilized by other people for years because they were so advanced. Guy was
well, and
incredibly creative. But
so here's a perfect like.
but I think that it's also
It's
one of
not
those.
even really a tangent.
Yeah.
But like Fela Kuti almost gets compared to King Tubby because of their proximity in time, but the outcome of their creations are so vastly different in terms of like Afro beats. You could say they're related to like dub music or dubstep, but they're not. It would be like saying a turkey is the same as a woodpecker because they're both related to a dinosaur back in their lineage, and that's like obviously
Yeah.
not. But that's where I feel like the tendency to reduce it doesn't. Okay, black musicians in history tend to get reduced to their uh, time period and era when they're not broken up that way by genre, and their genres may not overlap necessarily. So then when they get compared to each other, it's like a really forced. And you weren't doing that at all. I was the one that actually. So that's where I don't want it to seem like I'm making it seem like you were doing this whatsoever.
Hey, I know I
So,
wasn't doing that.
this was like in terms of like why I was framing the Caribbean as not being Western and being like effectively their own, um, having their own essence because there's an amalgamation of like African influence. There's definitely some like Western influence and Latin influence from their roots, but it's definitely a different like outcome in terms of North America and their output versus South America and then the Caribbean. Whereas like we don't we don't necessarily lump Argentinians and Chileans and Brazilians in when we're talking about us in the West. And even when I mean us in the West, I loosely mean like people who are not second or first generation immigrants who have to identify with this continent because we are so far removed from wherever we like have ethnic roots originally, if that's even possible. But that West has been so defined by whiteness for so long. And now that we're opening it up away from whiteness, it's like we want to claim things that are good and not never anything of the bad parts about it, which like Greeks, for example, um, the West wants to take Greek architecture and Greek sculpture and Greek uh, nomenclature, but they don't want to take Greek people. They don't want Greek immigrants. We'll take your culture. We'll take your, you know, start using your names for our fucking fraternities and sororities and shit. But Greek immigrants, no, y'all stay the fuck over there. So I think there's this element of like retroactive appropriation in terms of like, and again, you didn't start this. You as an individual weren't necessarily doing this. That's where in articulating like why the Caribbean hasn't been accepted as part of the West historically is why like if you go to Barnes and Noble's, Caribbean music has its own section. And that's what I was alluding to in terms of like I think it's ubiquitous in Western culture to have Caribbean music present and have access to it, but that doesn't necessarily make it Western, like by proxy of being here. I mean, not to say that the influence doesn't start going the other way too, in terms of like, then they start using guitars more and start including more Western influenced instruments into their music, which then it becomes this like world music, which transcends Caribbean or North American influence, which I think when you look at like Afro beats, um, a lot of Afro beats actually are transcending uh, a region because they'll be produced outside of Africa. And that's where like you get people in like Puerto Rico making Afro beats or like white people making Afro. Like you don't have to be black to make Afro beats. And I think that's where in terms of like the genres being defined by sound is secondary to them being defined by a region. And they can only hit that second phase once there's such a critical mass within a region of a similar sound, which is like genres happen in phases. And like when King Tubby started doing it, it wasn't called dub yet, but it was.
You went to his studio to get that dub mix sound. That was
Yeah.
the association. It was he had to run it through his mixing board and his various effects that were all, you know, way ahead of the curve. Nobody had auxiliaries and buses working the way that he did. He did things that we wouldn't fully understand for like 30 years, and now it's like practically part. Like if you don't do these things, you're not doing enough. It's like
Yeah, and even
it's
then,
immeasurable
sorry,
how deep his effect has been on electronic music.
definitely. Um, Even down to like dance hall music
Yeah,
being called dance hall, but now there's so many derivatives of it that you go listen to a house music, which technically originated in, Detroit and Chicago. And I mean, I guess, there's all these variations that originate in like different parts of the country, because there's some that originated in New York too. So it's like not all house music is equal either. um,
yeah. Philly house and Chicago house are not the same.
yeah, it's not the same. So to identify them as the same is like not really understanding the complexity. So it's like all these things have to happen regionally before they can become defined by the sound, which is
UK
then
garage and US garage are like almost completely different styles of electronic music.
yeah, because then there was like people were calling it two step. I mean, I guess technically that's what it's called, but it's called like two step in Britain, but it's like a breakbeat in America. You know what I mean? So it's like the exact same fucking thing.
But then speed
But
garage had a pulse because
then okay, it's the same thing by formula, but then if you listen to two step versus breakbeat, they're gonna sound completely
oh
different,
yeah.
even though fundamentally they're the exact same thing. And that's where
And then are
there's
we
this
talking about like breakbeats or like Miami breaks, which are also
right,
different?
yeah, for sure. So
And then not to
you
confuse
know
that with Miami bass, which is also a different breakbeat themed.
which it wasn't really an argument, um but it was like a very informed and spirited debate about like the origins of 808 music and shit like that, where I'm like, this dude was from Miami and he was like claiming that they made this shit popular. I'm like, well, kind of, that they definitely like were at the forefront, but as somebody not from Atlanta, I could definitely say that Atlanta and fucking Memphis, um, you know, there's multiple places that were influential in terms of making 808 music popular. Miami was definitely like one of the earliest, if not the earliest, but it was 1,000% not the only city that was pushing like 808 music.
Wasn't like African Bombata like from New York?
Yeah, yeah.
Telling me he didn't use an
Um,
808.
for sure. Of
Like
course, of course. It's
okay, so here's the thing,
absurd.
I think at this point the 808 is this highly romanticized sound that's not even being produced by a Roland drum machine anymore. It's being produced by like
Right.
synthesizers that are combining sine
Yep.
waves and some kind of impulse and heavy filtering so that they can get
Hmm.
that huge tail and then play it like an instrument. It's not even the 808 of yore, which, like, if I'm being really honest, that Roland drum machine is okay, but it requires so much damn processing to make it sound awesome that it's like anyone who thinks they can just plug one in and make it sound great are really only interested in recreating like 80s techno and using them for modern sounds. It's like you can, but there are a lot of functionally superior tools. And it's rough because the 808 itself, the sound, the idea of the 808 is so powerful, but the
It's very
reality, but the
romanticized. It's
reality of
very
the actual
romanticized.
808, that channel on that drum machine is like, wait, that's it? Seriously?
Well, and it's because people don't understand sound waves and envelopes, and peaks and troughs of waves and things like that. So they also don't understand layering in terms of like, there was a period in my life where I didn't understand it either. So I'm like, oh, I want to make a song that sounds like Dr. Dre. And it's like, well, if you don't understand that his snare is like three or four different sounds layered in one, then you're never going to be able to make anything
Oh
that
yeah.
sounds fucking remotely close until you're able to buy Dr. Dre uh fucking sound package, and then you think that just having the Dre snare with all of the layering works, but it doesn't sound right with what you're making. It only sounds right with what he made. So it like gives you the feeling of being able to do something without actually understanding what they did. So then it doesn't come out like they did it. So you get all these people, especially with electronic music, that they'll buy the fucking sound packs of their
And
favorite artists.
you can get free Dr. Dre sound kits and construction kits, like 600 hip hop production samples,
easy.
for
It's not
free.
It's not difficult. Not difficult to find, and they're good in terms
I'm
of
sure
like
a lot of these are actually really good.
The sounds are actually good quality, but it's putting them together in a cohesive music theory sound fashion that makes it sound like Dr. Dre if you're trying to
And not hip hop drum corps.
Right. And I think that's where, like, you know, if you don't understand that Dr. Dre sampled a lot of this shit in his early career as a producer versus the later career, he would find a sample and then have musicians play it and then resample it and do all these things in terms of like what he was doing got to be much more complex than it sounded on the output of somebody just listening to it on the radio. But if you went and looked at the complexity of, like, by the time he made Chronic 2001, he was trying to expand his production skill set in a way that also made his sound better. But also it wasn't just about the snare drum or the bass drum, but he was like trying to do very specific things, which is why then if someone wants to sound like him, you can't just listen to his music. You have to listen to his motivation. You have to listen to his process. You have to learn what influenced him, where he got his sounds from himself to really be able to do that, which is why
his equip board has a lot of very choice equipment. Like very, very choice equipment, like SSL consoles, more SSL consoles, like really like high-end processing, like samplers that in their day were top of the line. Ooh, a Toft console, those are real nice. High-end Avid systems, all HD stuff, more SSL consoles. Everything's an Apple computer. Like,
well, and I'll contrast that with I don't know if you remember the drum and bass artist Clips.
Oh yeah.
But Clips, a lot of people hated his stuff because they would call it like clown step. But then if you go look at his process, he was very much hands-on in creating his all of his sounds. So like he had, you know, the synthesizers he was using, any sound that would be on his tracks, he probably did the frequency modulation or the amplitude modulation to make it happen. And not necessarily everything, but that's why a lot of it sounded like, you know, it came off of some old analog synthesizer because it did. But then when people tried to emulate him and then it became like clown step as a genre, the people that didn't take the time to go through and manipulate all the curves did end up creating this generic sound that wasn't necessarily as when there's intricate sound design, there's something to actually be appreciated, whereas when there's no thought to the sound design, it's imitative and it's only meant to be a hollow shell. There's actually no substance. So I think that in terms of like when you get artists that don't have anything to say that just want to emulate somebody else, there is no actual substance. It's just the appearance of an artist because they're a mimic in the first place.
Yeah, it's a reflection. It's
Yeah,
an echo. It can never
which is
be fully resolved as the real
it's
thing.
the same as AI, and
Yeah.
I think that's like we've had those things happen before in terms of like hollow artists. Yeah, they can make it sometimes, but they don't stand out, so they don't really rise to the top. So I don't really like hollow art doesn't scare me so much as hollow consumers. And I think that's where it's like, yeah, hollow consumers will be sold on hollow art, but it doesn't have to be done by AI for that to be the case, which is where you get the mumble rappers. So I think that's where I'm like, we don't have to wait on AI to look at what happens with hollow art because we've had hollow art many times before.
Maybe AI will finally provide the filter that we need to prevent people that are making hollow or shallow attempts at art from trying to, do something that maybe they shouldn't be doing. Maybe it'll push people who are really just doing it because they love it. They'll keep doing it because that's their thing. But I think that at the point that Universal turns on their AI production system and starts spitting out hit after hit, they've created a moneymaker. That's their money-making machine. And that'll be it. Small independent studios that don't have enough like regional support for their artists aren't gonna be able to survive.
I mean, maybe, but
I think it'll be like truly dedicated collectives.
I'm not convinced.
I think
because
they're the ones.
Think about this for a second. Hinkle's went out of business, right?
Yeah, well,
but it wasn't because McDonald's existed.
Yeah, it's because they stopped making burgers.
Yeah,
people died.
So because McDonald's made it possible to spit out the cheapest version of a burger that was consistently a certain level of taste, that if you weren't worried about like, oh, I don't want a gourmet burger, I just want a burger, you can go there. That doesn't put Red Robin out of business. That didn't put Steak and Shake out of business. I mean, Steak and Shake's not gourmet.
Yeah, but I think that there are a lot of people out there who are trying to create the McDonald's burger of music and compete with like Universal, and they're going to disappear.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Those people they're going to be filtered out immediately, and people who are really dedicated to building their own regional following, they'll exist and they'll succeed because they will be really dedicated to it. But I don't think that what amounts to like a middlemaning marketing in microcosm, I don't think that can actually persist because they're not actually part of the music creation process or the creative process. Actually, they're only there to make money by letting people know things. And with internet and social media, those activities can be handled closer to the chest than handing it off to a third party that's only there to make money. AI can handle that. AI will do those things for people that are actually dedicated. The industry doesn't have to support that practice anymore. It's going to change a lot of things.
Well, I think you're right. And in terms of this makes me think of like Taco Bell, because Taco Bell didn't put out they didn't put small Mexican restaurants out of business, even though obviously Taco Bell's Tex-Mex. Like Juanita's thrives because Taco Bell is never going to be able to make a meal as good as Juanita's. I've never had a bad meal at Juanita's. I'm sure they've had days that are worse than others, but every meal I've ever had at Juanita's is always better than the best meal I've ever had at Taco Bell.
Even the worst taco that I've had at Juanita's was vastly superior to any taco.
Than the best taco at Taco Bell. And I think that's what's going to happen in terms of like output.
Yeah.
Like after a while, every place you go is going to be Juanita's that's still around in terms of like people aren't going to stop liking good alternative. Like if the alternative's better, good enough alternative's not going to put the better one out of business as far as I can tell.
Yeah. But we're going to see a reduction in the number of there's like a lifespan for projects that don't succeed. At least that's been the standard for the music industry for the last 20 years, it seems. Bands they have one really big album, and then that's it. They might have a second, but it's never as big as the first. And if they have a third, then they're really unique. Very few bands survive, multiple decades in the spotlight. I think that's part of the continuum, though. Even Quincy Jones couldn't stand the spotlight for the entirety of his, 7 decades.
He did better than most.
Fuck. Having a number one album in 3 distinct decades is, one of the hallmarks of success. So
yeah, that's like the Quincy Jones effect.
The Quincy Jones effect. Exceptional Radio. Exceptional Randos shows produced live in Sunroom Studios' Bass Capsule. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to